In 2.1, we'll be taking a look at terms, variables, constants, and coefficients, and it'll be a pretty quick section. We will just take a look at those, define them, or just look at examples to see what they're talking about. So let's start with variables. I have a feeling you already know what they are. A variable is a symbol, and as you probably know, it's usually a letter or letters used to represent two different things. So this may be new to you. It's either going to represent an unknown quantity, in other words, a number we don't know. For example, if we have the equation 3x plus 1 equals 5x minus 7, there's only one value of x that makes this true if we put that in for our x. And if you want to try it, x equals 4. So there's only one value that works in this equation. In contrast to that, we can also use variables to stand for any number of numbers. For example, you will see down here below 0 times a equals 0, where a is any real number. What that's saying is no matter what you put in for a, if it's a real number, you multiply it by 0, you're going to get 0. So there's not one particular number that works here, but a whole lot of them. Okay, a constant is just a single number. For example, 3, 2.8, negative 2/3. It's just a regular old number, and it's called constant because it doesn't change. 1.3 is always equal to 1.3. Another use of a number, though, is when it kind of multiplies or divides with a variable, and that is called a coefficient. It's a number, and just kind of informally, I'm just going to call it in front of a variable. And the one thing to remember is that coefficient is going to include an addition or subtraction sign before. Finally, terms, and this is very important, but I'm not going to give you the definition from the book. I think it's best just to look at a couple examples, and then you'll get a feel for what are terms. So in this first example, I have an expression, negative 2x squared plus 3xy minus 7. Okay. Do you see, if I tell you that there are 3 terms there, you go, oh yeah, I can see that. There's this term, and this term, and you'll see that I've listed those under terms. The first 2 terms are a little bit different than the last term because the first 2 terms have variables involved. So we call those, not surprisingly, variable terms. And the last guy, that minus 7, that's just a constant term because it has no variable. The coefficients of each of those terms, the coefficient of the first term, negative 2x squared, is just negative 2. It's the number we see in front. 3xy, that term has a coefficient of 3 because that's what we see in front. And negative 7, I've got the coefficient in parentheses. You could consider that also the coefficient, but you don't necessarily have to, and when we get to later chapters, I will explain further on that, how you could consider that the number in front of a variable that we don't see. Okay, so I'm going to say that's it for terms. I think that you can see what they are, the coefficients, and then finally, one thing to note. We see in this first example a little lonely x. So what does that mean? It means 1 times x. So it's a term, and it has a coefficient of 1. We don't write the 1 because, as I mention often, mathematicians are lazy, and it's just too much work to write that 1 times x. A cubed, what's its coefficient? Yeah, it's also 1. There's an implied 1 there, so it also has a coefficient of 1. Negative y. Well, I don't see a number in front, but there is that negative sign. What do you think the coefficient is? Yeah, negative 1 times y. It has a coefficient of a negative 1. Likewise, negative b to the 5th is the same way as writing negative 1 times b to the 5th. There is nothing wrong with writing that 1 in front while you're working through it to remind you that that 1 or negative 1 is there. But mathematicians, we like to write those expressions like that. One other thing I will point out, let's draw a line here. When you have, for example, the term 2xy, that is implying what relationship is going on between the 2 and the x and the y. Yeah, it's just multiplication. It just means 2 times x times y, and we mathematicians are so lazy, we just can't be bothered putting in that dot. Okay, that's your introduction to terms, variables, constants, and coefficients. I will see you in 2.1b.